What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video. And in this video, I'm going to be ranking all of the decks that I consider somewhat viable, or at least that I've covered in Android format. Now, these lists are always going to be subjective to an extent. Certain people will view certain decks as more viable than others, and frankly, the format is still very underexplored. So I can definitely see this tier list radically changing at some point in the future. But there are some things I'm pretty confident about in terms of where certain decks get placed. So I do think that, this will be a pretty accurate reflection of the format overall. And so I hope that if this is your first introduction to the format, then this should give you a relatively good idea of what the meta looks like. If you do want to see more videos about Android format, potentially showing off all these various decks in action, then you can check out my other videos on Android. But after this video, I'm going to be moving on into later formats, so I won't likely revisit Android too much, unless there are further developments that I can go back and talk about. If you want to follow my journey through these formats, then definitely subscribe to the channel. We're at about 670 subscribers now. I'd really like to reach 750 by the end of July, and it would be really awesome to reach 700 by the end of June. So if you enjoy my content and want more of it, definitely subscribe. In addition, if you enjoy the video, as always, please do leave a like down below. And also, if you want to play any games in Android format for yourself, we have a Discord server, link in the description down below. But it's a great place to find games in this format and also many others. But before I dive into the decks themselves, let me just talk about how this tier list is set up. So I've ranked the tier list tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, rogue, and trash. And oftentimes these designations often correspond with like tournament attendance. So if a certain percentage of people are playing a tournament with a certain deck, then it often falls into these tiers. Given that a lot of these old retro formats don't necessarily have the highest tournament attendance and tournament data, we can't really use these terms in quite the same way, so I'm just more using them as like a power level idea. So tier 0 would be if the deck is basically unbeatable, and the format just turns into mirror matches between the deck and itself at very high levels of play. If there isn't a tier 0 format, then tier 1 is the top of the heap. So these are decks that are all very powerful and will likely see a lot of tournament play and success, but they aren't necessarily a guaranteed win if they go up against each other. Tier 2 decks are still pretty good, but they're not quite at the power level of tier 1. Whether this means that they've got combos that are less consistent than the tier 1 deck's game plans, or it just means that what they actually do is less powerful than a lot of what the tier 1 decks do. These decks aren't necessarily the best in the format, but they will likely win you a couple games, especially if you're a skilled player. Rogue decks, on the other hand, are like a lot more jank. So this is where a lot of the more like jank sort of YouTube combo decks would go. The decks that, when they pop off, they can be really cool and can win you the game, but oftentimes there's not consistent enough to do that, or, they're doing something cool, but it's not quite enough to win the game. And then trash decks are just decks that I think are basically unwinnable. You play with them and you're just basically guaranteed to lose, even if they're somewhat fan favorites or they've got some hype around them. But with all those out of the way, let's dive in to this tier list. And instead of just going from left to right, I want to start off with the most prevalent deck in the format. And this might be actually one of my more controversial takes in this video, but that's Beast Spellcaster Tomato Control. And I actually think, this could easily be a tier 0 format with just Beast Spellcaster mirrors all day long. But I think given recent developments in the format, I'm actually going to put this in tier 1. And this may be a bit controversial because in the past, Android format has basically just been Beast Spellcaster mirror matches in the top cuts of tournaments. And this makes sense. The deck is very strong. It's basically just a good stuff pile, but unlike good stuff piles from previous formats, it's got a lot of aggressive pressure. And this can really make it hard for jank decks to work against it because it just doesn't give them the time that they'd have in previous formats. Things like Bazoo the Soul Eater, Kaiku, and Gemini Elf are all super good beat sticks that if decks aren't playing them, they might not be able to deal with. And they make rogue matchups against this very unforgiving. However, even if this is a tier 0 format, and I'm wrong about the placement of Beast Spellcaster, and there just aren't any decks that can compete with it, I still think Android format's pretty fun, as the Beast Spellcaster mirror match is really interesting. There are a lot of very neat interactions, and I do think that it's a very skillful mirror. So, I know that some people don't like formats that are tier 0 just because they're tier 0 and there's not really as much deck diversity. But I still find them very fun if they've got some good gameplay involved, and I definitely think Android does have that. But assuming that Beast Spellcaster is actually tier 1 and not tier 0, what other decks can potentially compete with it? As if it was the only deck in tier 1, then wouldn't that just be a tier 0 format? Well, the deck that I think has the most chance to compete with Beast Spellcaster is likely Equip Aggro. And, you know, while Equip Aggro could definitely be in tier 1 in the future, I've only tested it a couple of times, and while it did reach a top 3 finish in the latest Android format, that format was kind of low in attendance. It only had 20 players. So it's a good data point to have, and in testing, the deck does seem pretty sick and able to kill your opponent out of nowhere. But for now, I'm not quite comfortable putting it in tier 1. I'm more comfortable in putting it in tier 2. However, I do think that this is easily a tier 1 deck, and it actually is the reason why I'm putting Beast Spellcaster in tier 1 instead of tier 0, because I think this deck is sick, and I think that there are a lot of ways to experiment with it and improve it in the future to make it even better. On paper, the deck is kind of less consistent than Beast Spellcaster decks, as, you know, the equips kind of don't do anything on their own. They need monsters to go with them. So, you know, you're relying kind of on 2-card combos, but with the amount of damage that you can output in a turn and the ways to clear your opponent's reactive cards that can stop it, I do think that this is a worthwhile strategy to see in the future, and I do think that it has a lot of potential in this format as a tier 1 deck. So you can definitely count this as tier 1. There could be a tier 1.5 that you place this into as well. I don't necessarily believe in tier 1.5, and I do think that this deck is just either tier 1 or tier 2. It's either going to be like as good as I expect it might be, or it's just going to fall flat on its face, and the games that I've played with it and the top 3 finish were just strokes of luck. We don't know exactly at this point whether that is the case or not, so I encourage people to play with this more. And also, you know, I'll just mention this here. I'm lumping in a lot of decks into this Equip Aggro sort of category, so like Hayabusa OTK, which uses Hayabusa Knight plus equips to just kill your opponent in one turn. Things like Megamorph equip decks like playing Dark Elf or Jiraiya Gumo to lower your life points and make big Megamorph plays. I do think that there are a lot of different ways to go with this equip strategy, but they all sort of reduce down to the same thing of just making huge damage pushes with the equip cards, or just being forced to use them to out your opponent's monsters in a pinch. And because of this, I'm just going to lump them into one category. I do think that the Megamorph version of the deck is a lot better than Hayabusa Knight OTK, but I think that they're similar enough that I'm going to put them together. And let me know down in the comments whether you disagree with me. I will say, though, I don't think that Hayabusa Knight is tier 1, and I don't think it's Rogue. I do think that it falls into tier 2. So I do think that, you know, even though I'm lumping them together, they're in the same tier anyways. So this won't make too much of a difference. So while I think that those are the 2 top decks in the format, and so nothing else will actually be placed into tier 1 here, I do think that, you know, this is very much a work in progress, and I'm excited to see certain decks rise to tier 1 in the future potentially. And I definitely will revisit this tier list if new developments arise, and new developments could definitely arise, especially given the variety of other decks that people are playing in this format. So let's just go through the others left to right now that I think I've gotten the most important developments out of the way, starting with Dark Necrofear. Now, there are a couple different ways you can play Dark Necrofear. You could play it as just a card to tech into good stuff, like playing Giant Germs to facilitate the Fiend's Engrave. Or you could potentially play it like going all in on the Fiends, and playing things like Karibo or Earthbound Spirit, or just other Fiends that can get you value and then banish for Dark Necrofear. I think that as its good stuff version, I think that it probably is tier 2. Just because, like, I mean, it's basically good stuff, right? You've got Dark Necrofear kind of as an extender, which is pretty good. 2200 attack is nothing to scoff at, and 2800 defense can be very nice as well. I do think, though, that, like, Necrofear isn't the best boss monster, as it's just very easy to play around. It dies to Jinzo, dies to Bazoo, and there's so many ways to stop its effect from taking your monster. So I don't think it's the best boss monster, but I do really like it as an extender, and I think when being used as an extender, it can provide an extra damage push that can just kill your opponent out of nowhere. So I do think that this belongs in tier 2. Janked versions of it might go in Rogue, though. Keeping on with the sort of Bakura anime trend here, we've got Destiny Board. And Destiny Board, I mean, I made a video on it, and we almost actually won a game, not a match, but a game with it, against Exodia, which I don't really respect as a deck in this format. either way. So it probably isn't that surprising that I'm putting this in trash tier. I think this deck is really, really bad. This is probably the worst alt win condition in the game right now, just because it's so fragile. You know, your opponent having any form of spell and trap removal will stop your win condition dead in its tracks. And also, you know, having hand rips as well will also prove very problematic. There are other ways you could probably play this, like playing multiple Destiny boards, or maybe even playing like a Cold Wave version, so your opponent can't use spell and trap removal on your stuff. But I just think this deck is not very good at all, and it's just too many ways to stop it from doing what it wants to do. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in trash. And since I mentioned Exodia, I'll just talk about Exodia briefly here. I don't think that Exodia got anything to actually improve its standing from Imperial format, and I think it's actually gotten a lot worse in Android format, because Kaiku exists to banish pieces from grave, and also you're down a copy of Sangan. So it's a lot less good than an Imperial, and I also don't think it's doing anything new or gaining anything to help out its strategy. That's the reason why I didn't cover it in a video, and that's the reason why I'm not really mentioning it here. There are a lot of decks that are not very good, but are relics of previous formats, like Clown Control is another one, I'd say. And I could probably fill rows and rows of trash here with just a variety of decks that basically have no reason to be played in this format. However, I gotta draw the line somewhere, and the line I generally use is if it didn't gain anything new, and it was already like pretty rogue or trash in a previous format, then I generally won't cover it. And Exodia fell into that category here, unfortunately. If you want me to make an Exodia Android video in the future, or want me to talk more about it, let me know down in the comments below. But it's an unfortunate fact of Yu-Gi-Oh! That not every deck will be worth talking about in a given format. But moving on from that sort of tangent, we've got a deck that I think is pretty neat, and that's Relinquished. Now, Relinquished in Imperial format was actually potentially tier 1. I mean, I did get second place in a tournament with Relinquished, and it could have been tier 2 as well, but it was definitely in the tier 1, tier 2 sort of range. I think in Android format, it's actually pretty rogue here, if not trash. The reason for that is it still has a lot of the benefits that it had in Imperial format, where, you know, it's got the recruiters in the forms of Senju and Sonic Bird to sort of increase your deck's consistency, and also Relinquish acts as a form of removal, which is very nice as well. You can also recur it from graveyard pretty easily to suck up your opponent's monsters some more, but it isn't quite as well poised in this format based on what other decks are doing. In Imperial format, there are a lot of slower decks that are using a lot more flip monsters, and Relinquish really excels at that, as it can take your opponent's monster and also prevent it from getting any value. In addition, you know, Android format does have Kaiku, and Kaiku can banish your Relinquish out of the graveyard, and if your Relinquish is banished out of the graveyard, you can't really recur it as well. Also, Relinquish just kind of matches up poorly against the sort of triangle of Beat 6, Bazoo, Kaiku, Gemini, Elf, because, you know, if you suck up a Bazoo, then it's just going to be a 1600 attack point monster. So really, you can only suck up the Gemini Elf to get full value off of it, and your opponent can just run that over with a Bazoo of their own. So I don't necessarily think Relinquish is well poised in this format, and that's why I'm dropping it down to Rogue. It still is a pretty decent engine, which is why I don't think it's trash. It just isn't anywhere near as good as it was in past formats. Next up, we've got Fusion, and this is another deck that I think I'm going to put it in Rogue. It's a bit tough to say whether I want it above or below Relinquished. I think maybe above, if I can actually... There we go. I think that it might be above just because, you know, you can get out bigger bodies with the Fusion deck, and I do think that that's pretty valuable. It doesn't have ways to search out polymerization, which is a big flaw for it. And also, getting into Last Warrior can be a bit awkward, as you may have seen in the video I did on the deck. But I do think it's pretty good, and Last Warrior can really shut down your opponent's game plan pretty well. Also, Twin-Ended Thunder Dragon is just an incredibly powerful card. 2800 attack gets over pretty much anything else in this format. And I do think that it's pretty easy to make as a backup if you can't bring out Last Warrior. So I do think that it's pretty decent in that way. And also there are a lot of different ways that you can go with the deck. Things like Fusion Gate and Summoner of Illusions have both released, so you could potentially make a brew with those. There's just a lot of different ways to go with this deck, and I do think that it's not bad. So that's why I'm putting it in Rogue. I don't think it quite makes it to tier 2, given how many pieces you need for its combo. But, you know, maybe with further experimentation, it could rise in the future. Next up, we've got Water, and Water is another deck that you can build it in a lot of ways. And I actually think I'm going to put it in Rogue, because while those ways can be pretty decent, it's just generally underpowered, in my opinion. Like, I think the best things that you can be doing with it is like Catapult Turtle OTK shenanigans, and you can use things like Aqua Spirit or Revival Jam as sort of additional bodies for the Catapult Turtle. I actually saw a really cool deck that was using both Mystic Tomato and Mother Grizzly in conjunction with Cannon Soldier and Catapult Turtles to basically get a bunch of bodies on board for that play exactly. But I'm not quite sure if I've actually seen a build of the water deck that convinces me that it should be tier 2 or tier 1, as it just seems like very fragile, and it doesn't really feel to me like it has too many good ways of dealing with the aggressive nature of the Beast Spellcaster deck. So I'm not like the biggest fan of this. I would definitely really enjoy if water decks were higher than Rogue, as I think the deck would be pretty cool. There's a lot of very cool cards that you can play with it. But I'm just not convinced at this point, so I do hope that that changes in the future. Next up, we've got Burn, and Burn is a deck that I think I'm also going to place in tier 2, maybe above Necrofear. But Burn is like a deck that's been good throughout these old historical DM formats. But I think that the deck is not too much improved from how it was in Imperial format. And I do think that the larger aggressive pressure that other decks do have does make it a bit worse, as you just don't have the time that you had in previous formats to actually slowly burn your opponent to death. And you are also taking a lot more damage in general. So things like Chain Energy are a lot worse, as you're really feeling the double-edged side of that card when your opponent is hitting in with Bazoos and Kaikus and the like each turn. In addition, Solemn Wishes is a card that's introduced to this format, and that could be a really good side deck card against Burn. And so I do think that the general sort of Burn deck is not the best. I do think that it's decent, and that's why I'm putting it in tier 2. I do think that it can win games. It's like not terrible. I just don't think that it necessarily has a great matchup against the top decks in the format. Keeping on the theme of Burn, though, there's actually another Burn deck in this format that's a bit different from the general Burn deck that uses like Chain Energy and all that stuff, and that's Princess Burn. And Princess Burn, unfortunately, I think is a trash tier deck in this format. Basically, it aims to use Fire Princess along with some life point boosters to basically slowly burn your opponent out by 500 for each life point gain that you do. If you stack multiple Fire Princesses, this can add up more. And if you're able to sort of lock down the field with things like Gravity Bind plus Imperial Order, and your opponent doesn't have a way to access Jinzo, then you're feeling pretty good. Unfortunately, the main combo in it is very fragile, and in order to facilitate it, you have to play like basically two halves of the deck, one that locks down your opponent and one that burns them / gains you life points. And if you only draw one half of that deck or the other, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I also think that its burn strategy works too slowly, and giving your opponent a lot of time to deal with your board can be very disastrous when cards are just a lot more aggressive this format. So I do think that Princess Burn is a lot worse than regular Burn, and I don't actually think it can compete with a lot of the other decks on this list. I do think that it is better than Destiny Board, though, so there is that. Getting back to a deck that I think is actually really good, we've got Earth, and there are a lot of different ways to build Earth, from sort of Rat Box to Earth Beat, but I think that Earth at its best is more of a Rat Box variant, just using Giant Rat in conjunction with Mystic Tomatoes to just get more cards out of your deck, and also search out powerful monsters like Nimble Mamanga or Dream Clown. So I do think that this sort of variant of the deck is definitely tier 2. And I think maybe with more experimentation, it could rise to tier 1 in the future. I've seen a lot more people trying out the Mamangas and the Rats, and I think it is a sort of neat idea to experiment with more in the future. I think this deck does have a lot going for it, but it just hasn't really seen much tournament success as of yet. And I do think the versions of the deck that would be tier 1 are like too close to actual Beast Spellcaster territory for me to really call them like Rat Box decks. So I don't know. I think that this deck is going to be experimented with a lot more in the future, and that sort of experimentation will be able to sort of definitively say whether this is tier 1 or tier 2. But this is potentially another deck that can compete. I don't think it's quite as good as Equip Aggro, but I do think that it is another way to play a sort of good stuff-esque build. That isn't just the standard sort of Beast Spellcaster builds that we see running around. So I do hope to see that rise higher in the future. I will mention, just like with Equip Aggro, I'm kind of lumping a couple decks in here. There is Earth Beat using things like Rock Spirit or Gaia Power, or even saw one duelist using Amazon's Archer as well. So just getting really aggressive with your damage outputs. I do think that this version of the deck is a lot worse. I'd probably place it more in Rogue alongside Water, but I'm being generous here and lumping it in with the other Earth decks. Moving on, we've got a deck that I think is actually pretty sick after testing it out. I was kind of skeptical going into it, but I actually liked how it played quite a bit, and that's the Masked Beast. Now, I am going to put this in Tier 2 alongside Relinquished, and I actually think I might put it under Relinquished, as it does cost you a lot more than Relinquished does to bring out. But in an aggressive format like this, having access to a 3200 attack point monster can be brutal and can just kill your opponent out of nowhere. And I do think that this deck had a really good showing in the games I played with it. I think that it's very bricky, and it maybe isn't the most consistent thing in the world. But it is very fun, and it's a blast to play, and when it does go right, it feels really good. So that's why I'm going to put it in Rogue here. Lastly, we've got a deck that a lot of people do view as a bit degenerate, but it is an important deck to mention, and that's Empty Jar. Now, Empty Jar, along with Burn, is one of these DM-era degenerate stall decks that basically aims for not quite an alt-win condition in the form of Burn, but definitely an alt-win condition in the form of Empty Jar, where you're just trying to deck your opponent out. Now, it did gain some powerful tools in this format through things like Needleworm, but I do think that this deck isn't necessarily as good as it has been in the past. Unlike in later iterations of the deck, that would become more combo-oriented when things like Book of Moon and Book of Taiyu came out. This deck is just very slow and grindy, and it can be used to deck out your opponent, but there are just so many ways to sort of play around it, especially in side decking, especially when decks now have access to things like Penguin Knight that just completely invalidate this deck's win con. So I am going to put it in Rogue, I think maybe at the top of Rogue, just because I do think that it does have potential to rise in the future. There are maybe things that people can do with this deck to potentially improve it. But as it is now, I'm not convinced that this deck is really good. And I actually think that it's a lot worse than it has been in the past. And it's definitely worse than how it will be in the future. But what do you all think about this tier list? I mean, I know it's kind of unorthodox because I've got just one deck in tier 1. Which, you know, would make it seem like this is a tier 0 format. And it very well might be if more people experiment and find that that's the case. But as of now, I think there is a lot of potential in this format for it not to be tier 0. And I do think that there are a lot of interesting sort of strategies that people have hit on recently that could potentially contest be Spellcaster for the top meta deck. But I'm always curious to hear what you all think. These tier lists are subjective, as I mentioned. Other people will definitely view the format differently than I do here. So let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.